guys, what is up? Okay, we had to do this. It needed to be done. We need to talk about Deny. Alright, so Deny in Runeterra, you guys know what Deny is. It's a 3-mana Ionia card at fast speed. It's able to effectively counter any spell that's at, slow or fast speed that your opponent plays, or some on-play effects. There's a kind of random list of kind of what play effects it's able to counter, but anything that goes on the stack, basically, and needs to resolve. Now, the question is, is Deny a problem? Is it overpowered? And if you've paid attention to the Runeterra community, you know that there's people on both extremes, like quite a lot of people on both extremes. There's some people that think that Deny is single-handedly ruining the game, and Ionia should be every region, every deck should run second color Ionia, or something like that. And there's people that say, Deny is super, super fine, and they're actively going to be mad if Riot even touches it a little bit. And as always, usually in these cases, the answer is somewhere between those, as it is in this case. So in this video, we're going to be breaking down effectively the pros and cons of Deny, tackling some arguments voiced by, the community that I've seen, that we've all probably seen, and talking about, like, game design implications, and, generally, like, where we want a card like this to be at. Okay, so we're going to go through and talk about the complaints of Deny, what the problems are, what it adds to the game by being in the game. Now, if you want to just skip to my proposed solution at the end, I'm going to leave a pinned comment with the timestamp that you can go to. But I personally think that context matters, and we really need to understand the problem or perceived problems with Deny before talking about what even should or shouldn't be done with it, right? That's very, very important. I'll also go on to say that I think that, coming from Magic the Gathering, there's a pretty big misconception. I think, like, most Magic the Gathering players, when they come to Runeterra, they think Deny is, like, kind of garbage. I know I did, because you kind of in your head compare it to, like, a counter spell, and it's like, oh, these Hearthstone babies don't know how to deal with the counter spells, or something like that. That's, like, I don't know, pretty commonly, like, how people treat it. But it's pretty different from counter spells. Like, yeah, you can't use it on everything, but the fact that you don't have to reserve mana for it, and the fact that in a lot of, like, late game scenarios, you're kind of open attacking at full mana, so you've got, mana up for Deny for combat tricks, like, no matter what you're doing. It makes it a pretty different beast than counter spells in Magic. The first problem, not necessarily first in terms of intensity, but that people talk about, is Deny is auto-include. Okay, so auto-include is a very powerful word to talk about. Yes. The idea of auto-include is in card games. Auto-include is if you're in this color, this is in your deck, basically. Deny is actually, I think I would agree with that. I think it is actually basically auto-include. Like, there's some strange Ionia decks that can think about cutting it, but even the aggressive versions probably should be running it. It is, to some degree, auto-include. That being said, I do think that most decks are running 2 copies of Deny more often than 3, I think is going to be, fairly standard. It depends on, like, how the meta resolves. Obviously, as players get better, Deny's value is going to go down, because there is some concept of playing around Deny or building around Deny, right? So it's not as if, the experience that we had, against Deny is going to stay the same. Like, it is a thing that gets more value as people aren't prepared for it, right? So, Deny being auto-include. Is this an issue? So effectively, I would say the answer is no. At the end of the day, especially when you are dealing with a small card pool, there will always be some things that are going to be auto-include, and there's nothing you can do about that as a developer. You have cards like Hapless Aristocrat or Avarosan Sentry that I think are basically going to see play in every single deck for the same reason. I could sit here and I could name, like, 10 different cards that are going to be in effectively, like, every deck within that region, like, kind of no matter what you can do about it. Well, why don't I actually pull it up? Let's see, in terms of, like, my own card ratings, we've got cards like Fleet Feather Tracker that I think are going to be effectively auto-include, right? There's cards like Vile Feast that I think is pretty hard to escape from as well. You can look at, like, Hapless Aristocrat and Vile Feast and say, maybe they're not run in Shark Chariot decks in particular, so maybe that's, like, one minor exception. I'm not even sure they shouldn't be running those decks, to be perfectly honest, but, it's possible there's some very minor exceptions. But the point is that there will always be decks that will basically always want to run some amount of cards. And again, as a developer, you tend to have to, you do want to create diversity when possible, but it's not possible to do all of the time. So your best bet is to, instead of avoiding creating like super auto-include stuff, just make sure that the stuff that you do have, hopefully limited amounts of things that are auto-include, is going to promote healthy play patterns for your game, right? And this is kind of the number one thing about design that's really important and that a lot of people forget. The idea of, different strategies are kind of meant to be balanced at different levels. We see balance typically as a curve with, okay, so there's a concept of a balanced curve, right? And things are either above curve, which means they're powerful, or below curve, which means they're not really used, or, you can't really see them as competitive cards, right? That's the power curve. And the idea is, the most important thing about the power curve basically is that not every design of card is designed to be at the same point in the power curve, right? Certain kinds of cards are definitely, they are kind of designed to be weak cards. An easy example of that is Cataclysm. That's fine. I mean, that's almost too easy of an example. It doesn't really help, because it's so obvious that Cataclysm is not designed as a power card, right? Like it's kind of a meme. It's supposed to be, that kind of design is intentionally lower on the power curve than it should be. On the other hand, though, certain kinds of design are meant to be above the power curve. So people that are complaining that Deny is quote-unquote OP, I mean, it is true. It's a little OP. I actually agree with that, and that's why I have a tweak that I'm going to talk about later. But for the most part, it's not something that should really surprise anyone. Deny as a concept is the way it is implemented into the game, and the impact that the card's existence has on how players have to play is pretty healthy for the game overall. It gives you, an answer to certain crazy late game, but most importantly, this is what it does. It allows players to have kind of dynamic and kind of planning ahead interactions. You put the opponent on having Deny based on their colors, how they're playing, and how they're using the tools in their hand. That's going to affect how you play. It creates this kind of, not necessarily mind game scenario, but it creates a scenario where you and your opponent are both thinking about what's going to happen. It kind of forces you to think ahead. That's a really healthy thing. That kind of card that forces both players to think in that way and, creates a lot of interesting scenarios that you can play around. These are the kinds of cards that are kind of meant to be very competitive, right? So I would say the fact that it is auto-include and it is OP are not necessarily valid criticisms, personally. Although, again, I do think it is a little stronger than it should be, basically. But even though it is in pretty much every Ione deck, it's closer to a 2-of in those decks, and I could see it getting lower than that depending on, how the meta plays out as well. All right, the next argument about Deny is that it is oppressive. Now, this I agree with, actually. Oppressive is a term in card game and strategy in general, which basically means the card's existence in the card pool has a net subtractive impact on the pool, which is to say, Deny existing in the pool creates like one new cool thing you can play with, right? But just by existing, there's so many cards that, like, the big cards that cost like 6 or more mana, that, kind of like you have huge downswings against Deny because, it just interrupts you and you can't really do what you want. These are cards like Judgment. These are cards like Harrowing. These are cards like maybe Ruination. These are cards like Pack Mentality, which I actually cut out of my decks for, maybe that was part of my reasoning. But the idea is, very expensive cards. There's a lot of kind of expensive spells that it kind of feels like you sort of can't run just because Deny exists, right? It's like, it's pretty hard to run those cards. And to a degree, this is actually true. For the most part, yeah, this is probably the most negative impact Deny has on the meta is the oppressive factor. Like, this is totally valid, and it's not a good feeling just trying to build a deck and being like, dies to Deny, or as we used to say on Hearthstone, dies to Big Game Hunter, right? It's just that feeling of just, I can't use like all these cool cards I want to use, right? And these are often among the like kind of coolest, flashiest cards in the game too, right? So definitely there's some points there. It's also very important to note when it comes to the concept of oppressiveness, it's not just like high mana cards that also feel a bit oppressed by Deny, but in certain deck builds, some like just Deny counterable cards in general, like some basic fast speed spells, can feel very oppressed by Deny. What I mean by that is specifically is when you're in the deck builder, when you're trying to design your deck, if you're kind of at the end of the deck and you notice that your deck only runs one fast card in it, let's say. 2 copies of one fast card in it, right? Unless it's a card that your deck really relies upon, you as a deck builder should look at that and think to yourself, you know, I mean, a lot of people on ladder are going to be running Deny, right? It's going to be in effectively a third of opponents' decks if we assume equal distribution across regions, which of course shouldn't be the case, but Ionia is not a weak region, so it might even be a bit more than that. And effectively, if I just cut down on these 2 fast cards in my deck, I can kind of brick my opponent's Deny that might be in their deck, right? Something like that. And that's a common thought process you'll have in deck building in general. Basically, the idea of if you think your opponent is going to run a counter to something, you should either be running 0 of that something or a good amount of that something. Running 1 of something that there's a common counter for on ladder isn't really a good idea. So there actually would be a few decks that also might think about just cutting their last fast speed spell because of that as well. Now you might say this adds nuance to the deck building process. In a way it kind of does, but in general this would be considered bad design, or not bad design, but kind of a bad consequence of a certain design, right? Like one bad consequence, which is that, you know, I am forced to kind of like not do something that I want to do as a deck builder just to make my opponent, my potential opponent, not do something they would want to do either, which is denied, basically. I'm kind of like silencing both of us in a symmetrical way, which I don't want to have to be incentivized to do. And the last argument about deny is that it should be removed entirely, and this kind of concept just doesn't work in this game. Which is an argument I don't subscribe to in any way, basically. The idea of just kind of like nerfing something by deleting the concept, I think, is definitely done as like a last resort. As a designer, you really want to be figuring out ways to kind of like rebalance it and tool it up. Like as a random example, so this is kind of like the most basic, the first principle of like, you know, how to nerf something. Maybe make it cost 4 mana, right? Obviously, in a mana-based card game like Hearthstone, Magic, or Runeterra, nerfing something by 1 mana is a really, really big, not necessarily death sentence for every single card, but for most cards it will be a death sentence, right? Like 1 mana is a really huge deal. If you wanted Deny as a concept to exist in the game in a weaker form, I wouldn't mind the idea of trying it out at 4 mana. It's honestly possible it would be a bit too weak at 4 mana, but at the very least, if you want that concept to still feel like something that can fit into some decks, or, you know, maybe you do want it to exist, but without limiting a lot of the more expensive mana plays you can make, then, you know, maybe 4 mana is a decent suggestion. I honestly don't hate the suggestion. It's a really... I mean, it's kind of the most simple suggestion you can make, but I have no real problem if they just made Deny 4 mana. I think that would be okay. What I would like to see done with Deny, however, is a keyword that, you know, isn't in the game yet, but I think actually kind of needs to exist in the game. And I would actually be pretty surprised if Riot wasn't planning to add this keyword into the game as soon as set 2. This is the kind of thing that their game probably does need, which is it's a keyword to be attached to spells, placeholder name. Let's say it's called Arcane or Ancient, or it doesn't really matter what it's called. But the concept of the keyword is basically this spell can't use spell reserve mana. So it can only use normal mana. I think this is a pretty necessary concept to exist in Runeterra. I think even if they didn't want to use this for Deny, this would be something that had to be in the game at a certain point. There's a lot of proactive spells that sort of have to be overcosted in terms of mana, just because you can cheat them out early. A good example of that is something like War Mother's Call is an okay example, or the Harrowing, right? The Harrowing isn't 10 mana because it needs to be a 10 mana spell. It's 10 mana because you don't want to let players play it before turn 7. More so. I mean, both kind of apply, but you kind of open yourself up to sort of more ways of retooling and rebalancing like late game spells. Maybe you don't want it to, you know, cost 10 mana. Maybe you want it to cost 8 mana, but you can't play it before round 8, right? You can't cheat this out because it costs normal mana. So where this would interact with Deny is pretty important. It increases counterplay, which is probably the single most important thing about Deny, because when you're sitting on an expensive card, you might not feel like you have counterplay, right? You might feel like, well, the opponent's just going to save 3 mana no matter what they do, and it's not really at a cost to them, because that's the 3 spell reserve mana no matter what. So I can't really save this for later, right? I can't really play my... I can't really ever use my judgment that I want to get a big judgment off and I want that to be cool, right? So you can really make the opponent kind of pay the price for keeping Deny in their hand if Deny costs normal mana instead of potentially spell reserve mana, right? Imagine a scenario where we're in a late game situation. Maybe I have Deny and you're playing something that might have a big mana threat. Let's just say Judgment for the sake of ease. So I have to, as a Deny player, I have to make a bit of a sacrifice to enable it, right? I have to look at my Deny, you know, and be like, well, if I play a unit this round, a big unit, maybe I can't then deny your Judgment. So maybe this causes me to either pass or play a smaller unit. You know, let's say I play a smaller unit because I want to leave the Deny open as an option, okay? And you're sitting on your Judgment, and maybe you play something small that doesn't commit you out of your mana range, and then it's back to me, and I'm thinking, man, I really want to keep this Deny open, but he's still in Judgment range. You know, do I play another unit that I want to play, or and then risk just getting Judgmented and not having a Deny up, or do I instead make the sacrifice and keep this mana open so that I can kind of hand read and, you know, play around my lose condition and get the Deny off, right? So that's something that this keyword would accomplish in this form, and basically it would achieve a bit more of a similar feeling to kind of counterspells in Magic, where counterspells were a bit more fair because, of course, they were kind of telegraphed. You could tell, you know, when the opponent was saving mana, and also, you know, you had the opportunity to kind of, you know, when they would happen and when they wouldn't, and you could play around them a bit more. Alright, so that's it. Basically, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, Deny, where people are kind of right about it, where people are maybe a little wrong about it in terms of, like, exaggerating a point. But overall, it is nice that this kind of effect is in the game. It might be just a little bit too easy to get off in certain situations, and I definitely wouldn't delete it or anything crazy like that. Alright, guys, that's going to be it for me, and I'll see you guys next time.